October 26, 1942, 10,000 feet above the Solomon Islands. The air inside the cockpit of the Aichi D-3A dive bomber smells of high-octane fuel and sweat. Below, the Pacific Ocean is a flat, endless blue, broken only by the white wakes of the American Task Force 61. A Japanese pilot, a veteran of Pearl Harbor, tightens his grip on the stick. He banks his Val bomber sharply to the left. A split second later, a black cloud of smoke erupts exactly where his plane had been. Then another, then three more. Boom, boom, boom. To a terrifying degree, the sky is filled with shrapnel. The American ships down there, the Hornet, the battleships South Dakota, are throwing up a wall of steel. It looks impenetrable. It looks like suicide. But the pilot is smiling. He knows something the Americans are only just beginning to admit to themselves. The explosions are in the wrong place. He pushes the nose down, screaming into a 70-degree dive. The anti-aircraft fire intensifies. Tracers from 20mm Ehrlichins arc toward him, but they are too light to stop him unless they hit the engine block. The real danger, the heavy 5-inch shells that can turn his plane into confetti, are exploding 300 feet behind him. He drops his bomb. It whistles down and slams into the flight deck of the carrier. He pulls up, heavy G-forces crushing him into the seat, and weaves through the black puffs of smoke, untouched. This wasn't luck. This was math, and the math was on Japan's side. Here's the thing about early World War II anti-aircraft fire. It was largely a guessing game. The standard U.S. Navy 5-inch shell was a marvel of mechanical engineering, but it had a fatal flaw. It relied on a mechanical time fuse. Think about the complexity of what the gunners on the USS South Dakota were trying to do that morning. First, a rangefinder operator has to visually track a Japanese Zero moving at 300 miles per hour. He yells out a range, let's say 4,000 yards. That data goes to a computer, a literal heavy metal box of gears and cams, which calculates where the plane will be in the 10 seconds it takes the shell to get there. Then a signal is sent to the turret. Inside the turret, a loader shoves a 55-pound shell into a fuse setter. This machine physically rotates a ring on the nose of the shell, setting a timer. Tick, tick, tick. Finally, the shell is fired. If the timer is set to 10.5 seconds, the shell explodes at 10.5 seconds. But if the Japanese pilot changes altitude by just 50 feet, the shell explodes harmlessly above or below him. If the pilot speeds up, it explodes behind him. If the fuse setter was off by a fraction of a second, it's a miss. The Japanese pilots knew this. They called it jinking. You don't fly in a straight line. You weave. You change altitude. You make the American gunners recalculate. By the time the Americans have the new solution, you've moved again. In 1942, the statistics were depressing. It took the U.S. Navy roughly 2,000 to 3,000 rounds of heavy ammunition to shoot down a single aircraft. That means for every one plane that splashed into the water, nearly 3,000 55-pound shells were wasted, exploding in empty air. Back on the Hornet, the gunnery crews were working until their hands bled. The barrels of the 5-inch guns were blistering hot, paint peeling off the steel. They were doing everything right. They were following the procedure. They were filling the sky with flak. But the Vals and Kates kept coming. On that day in October, the Hornet was hit by 4 bombs and 2 torpedoes. 2 damaged Japanese planes even deliberately crashed into her. The volume of fire she put out was massive, but it wasn't accurate enough to create a true shield. By the next morning, the mighty Hornet was at the bottom of the ocean. Japanese commanders looked at the battle reports and felt a surge of confidence. The Americans had industrial might, yes. They had more ships, yes. But their technology hit a ceiling. No matter how many guns they bolted onto a battleship, they couldn't overcome the variable of human reaction time. As long as a pilot had nerves of steel and a quick hand on the stick, he could penetrate the screen. The Japanese Navy believed they had solved the problem of American air defense. They mocked the heavy, clumsy walls of flak that were so easy to slip through. But thousands of miles away, in a secret garage laboratory in Maryland, a group of frantic physicists was looking at that same math problem. They realized that trying to set a timer on a shell was a dead end. You couldn't predict where the plane would be. So they asked a question that sounded insane to military brass. What if the shell
decided when to explode. They didn't want a timer. They wanted a shell that could see. The Japanese pilots celebrating the sinking of the Hornet didn't know it, but the clock was already ticking on their air superiority. The era of the jinking pilot was about to end, and it was going to end because of a glass vacuum tube the size of a peanut.
The Japanese pilots celebrating the sinking of the Hornet didn't know it, but the clock was already ticking on their air superiority. The era of the jinking pilot was about to end, and it was going to end because of a glass vacuum tube the size of a peanut. November 1942, the Applied Physics Laboratory, Silver Spring, Maryland. While the Pacific Ocean was burning, a different kind of war was being fought inside a nondescript brick building just outside Washington, D.C. There were no explosions here, only the hum of electronics, the smell of soldering irons, and the shouting of a man named Merle Tuve. Tuve was the head of Section T of the National Defense Research Committee. He was a physicist, but he didn't act like one. He acted like a man whose hair was on fire. He had a sign on his wall that read, "I don't want the best weapon in the world. I want the best weapon effective today." The British had come to him with a concept. They had figured out the theory of a proximity fuse, a tiny radio transmitter that could send out a signal, bounce it off a target, and trigger an explosion when the return signal was strong enough. The theory was sound. The engineering, however, was considered impossible. To make this work, you had to take a radio station, which in the 1940s was a piece of furniture the size of a refrigerator filled with delicate glass vacuum tubes, and shrink it down to the size of a milk bottle. That was the easy part. The hard part was that this radio station had to be shoved inside the nose of a 5-inch artillery shell. Then it had to be fired out of a cannon. Let's break down the physics of that violence. When a 5-inch gun fires, the shell experiences 20,000 Gs of force. That is 20,000 times the force of gravity. If you weigh 150 pounds, for a split second, you would weigh 3 million pounds. But that's not all. The rifling in the barrel grabs the shell and spins it to stabilize its flight. The shell goes from 0 spin to 25,000 rotations per minute. Instantly. Every military expert said the same thing. You cannot put glass vacuum tubes inside a cannon shell. The glass will shatter, the filaments will snap, the solder joints will liquefy. It was like trying to strap a grandfather clock to a jackhammer and expecting it to still keep time. But Tuve and his team didn't care about impossible. They cared about the casualty reports coming in from the Solomon Islands. They began a brutal process of trial and error. They built tiny glass tubes, the T3 tubes, and embedded them in rubber. They failed. They tried suspending them in oil. They failed. Then they tried something radical. They decided to encase the delicate electronics in a solid block of beeswax and rosin. It was a crude form of what we now call potting. They poured the hot wax around the glass tubes, letting it harden into a solid brick. They took these prototypes to a field and shot them straight up into the air. They didn't even aim at anything. They just wanted to see if the radio was still transmitting when it hit the ground. For months, the results were silence. The shells would fire and the radios would die instantly. The pressure was mounting. The Navy was losing ships. Merle Tuve was sleeping in the lab. Then, a breakthrough. They realized the filaments inside the tubes were snapping from the vibration. They redesigned the glass structure. They created a battery that was inert until the shell was fired. A wet battery where the acid was contained in a glass ampule that shattered upon firing, using the centrifugal force of the spinning shell to power the acid into the plates and power the radar. It was genius. The weapon literally woke up because of the violence of its launch. January 5th, 1943, the Chesapeake Bay. The cruiser USS Cleveland sat anchored in the cold water. The Navy brass were there, arms crossed, skeptical. They'd heard big promises from scientists before. A drone aircraft, a rudimentary target plane, was launched from the shore. It buzzed across the gray sky, simulating a torpedo bomber on an attack run. On the deck of the Cleveland, the gunners loaded the new Mark 32 shells. They looked identical to the old ones, except for a plastic nose cone instead of a metal tip. The drone came within range. Bam! Bam! The Cleveland fired a salvo. The gunners didn't have to perfectly time the fuse. They just had to get close. The first shell missed by 50 feet. In the old days, that would have been a wasted shot, but as the shell passed the drone, the tiny radio inside screamed, "Target detected." A microsecond later, the detonator fired. A puff of black smoke erupted near the drone's right wing. Shrapnel tore through the fuselage. The drone shuddered, dipped, and spiraled into the bay. The Navy officers on the deck lowered their binoculars. They were stunned. Usually a test like this took dozens of rounds. The Cleveland had done it immediately. Merle Tuve had done the impossible. He had built a smart weapon in a dumb world. But now came the terrifying part. The secret was so valuable, so dangerous, that the combined chiefs of staff made a controversial decision. The VT fuse, or variable time fuse, was banned from being used over land. They were terrified that if a shell fired at a German tank failed to explode, the Nazis would find it, reverse engineer it, and use it to wipe out Allied bomber fleets over Berlin. So, the weapon was restricted to the open ocean, where duds would sink to the bottom of the sea. This meant the Japanese pilots in the Pacific were about to become the test subjects for the most advanced electronic weapon in history, and they had absolutely no idea it was coming.
This meant the Japanese pilots in the Pacific were about to become the test subjects for the most advanced electronic weapon in history, and they had absolutely no idea it was coming. June 19, 1944, the Philippine Sea, west of the Mariana Islands. The sun was high and bright over the largest carrier battle in history. This was the moment the Imperial Japanese Navy had been waiting for. They called it Operation A-Go. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa had assembled a massive force, 9 aircraft carriers and hundreds of planes. His plan was simple: launch massive waves of aircraft, overwhelm the American defenses, and smash the U.S. Fifth Fleet. In the ready rooms of the Japanese carriers, spirits were high. The pilots were told that the American defense relied on volume, not precision. If you kept your speed up, if you wove through the bursts, you could get through. They had done it before. They mocked the clumsy American gunners who wasted thousands of rounds hitting nothing but clouds. At 10 a.m., the first massive wave of Japanese aircraft, 69 planes, appeared on American radar. They were met by U.S. Hellcat fighters first, which took a heavy toll, but many Japanese planes broke through the fighter screen. They could see the American battleships and destroyers below. The pilots tightened their formations. They prepared to dance through the flak. Down on the surface, the gunnery officer on the battleship USS North Carolina watched the incoming specks. He didn't look worried. He looked like a man about to water his lawn. "Commence firing," he ordered. The 5-inch guns roared. Up in the sky, a Japanese pilot saw the flash of the guns. He instinctively banked left, aiming for the empty air between the predicted shell bursts. But the bursts didn't wait. A shell whizzed past his wing. In 1942, that would have been a safe miss. But today, the radar in the nose of that shell screamed, boom. The shell didn't need to hit him. It just needed to be within 70 feet. The explosion shredded his tail control surfaces. He spun out of control. To his right, his wingman pulled up to avoid another burst. A shell passed under him. The radar reflected off the belly of his plane. Boom! Shrapnel tore upward, piercing the fuel tank. The plane turned into a fireball. Panic set in. The Japanese formation began to break. Pilots tried every trick in the book. They dived. They climbed. They jinked wildly. It didn't matter. The air around the American ships had become toxic. It wasn't just a wall of fire anymore. It was a smart minefield. On the American ships, the loaders were rhythmic, almost bored. They shoved the VT-fused shells into the breaches. They didn't have to fiddle with the fuse setters. They didn't have to guess the range. They just pointed and shot. One observer on an American destroyer later described the scene. It was like watching a gardener with a hose. They just sprayed the sky, and the planes fell like dead leaves. The safety zone that Japanese pilots had relied on for 2 years was gone. If you were in the sky, you were a target. By the time the sun set, the statistics were hard to believe. The Japanese had launched 373 planes. Only 130 returned. The Americans lost just 29 planes.
The pilots who did make it back to the Japanese carriers were shaken. They reported that the American fire was unnaturally accurate. They claimed the Americans must have developed a new kind of heavy machine gun because they couldn't explain how heavy artillery shells were hitting agile fighters with such precision. The Americans had a different name for it. One pilot from the USS Lexington landed and shouted, "Hell, this is like an old-time turkey shoot." The phrase stuck, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The mockery was over. The Japanese pilots weren't laughing at the clumsy American gunners anymore. They were terrified of them. The VT fuse, combined with better fighters and radar, had completely broken the back of Japanese naval aviation. But as the war moved closer to the Japanese homeland, the enemy's desperation forced a change in tactics. If a pilot couldn't survive the flight back to base, why plan for the return trip at all? The VT fuse had solved the problem of the conventional attacker, but now it was about to face the ultimate test, a human-guided missile that didn't care if it died as long as it took a ship with it.
The VT fuse had solved the problem of the conventional attacker, but now it was about to face the ultimate test, a human-guided missile that didn't care if it died as long as it took a ship with it. October 25th, 1944, Leyte Gulf, the Philippines. The dawn sky was gray and heavy. The sailors on the escort carrier USS St. Lo were exhausted. They had been fighting off the Japanese fleet for days, but now something new was happening. A Zero fighter appeared low on the horizon. It wasn't dropping a torpedo. It wasn't diving to release a bomb. It was flying straight and level, the engines screaming at maximum RPM. The gunners on the St. Lo tracked it. This time, the pilot didn't weave. He didn't jink. He simply lined up the carrier's bridge in his sights and held the stick steady. He was a kamikaze, the divine wind. This was a gunner's nightmare. A conventional kill wasn't enough. If you shot off the plane's wing, the momentum might still carry the wreckage into the ship. If you set the plane on fire, it just became a flaming missile. To stop a kamikaze, you didn't just have to hit it, you had to disintegrate it. You had to turn the pilot into pink mist or shred the engine block into scrap metal before it crossed the final 500 yards. The 5-inch guns opened up. The VT fuses woke up. Because the kamikaze flew a steady path, the radar shells had a perfect solution. The air in front of the incoming plane turned into a meat grinder. The VT shells didn't need a direct hit. They exploded feet away from the cockpit, sending high-velocity, jagged steel through the thin aluminum skin. Observers watched as kamikaze after kamikaze simply dissolved in mid-air. One moment a plane, the next a cloud of debris raining harmlessly into the ocean. While the St. Lo was tragically lost to an attack that got through, the VT fuse saved the rest of the fleet. Without it, the Navy estimated the losses to kamikazes would have been 3 times higher. Meanwhile, 6,000 miles away in London, a different kind of suicide weapon was terrorizing the British public. The Germans had launched the V1 flying bomb, the Doodlebug. These pulse-jet cruise missiles buzzed over the English Channel at 400 miles per hour, faster than most fighters could catch. British anti-aircraft gunners were desperate. They were shooting down only 17% of the V1s. The rest were slamming into London neighborhoods. General Eisenhower and Prime Minister Churchill looked at the secret charts. They knew the VT fuse was sitting in stockpiles, banned from land use to protect the secret. But London was burning. Eisenhower made the call, lift the ban. The Americans shipped thousands of VT fuses to the coast of England. They moved the anti-aircraft guns to the shoreline to ensure duds fell into the water. The result was instantaneous and shocking. In the first week of using the VT fuse, the kill rate jumped from 17% to 50%. By the last week of the V1 campaign, Allied gunners were shooting down 79% of all incoming missiles. On one single day, 104 V1s were detected flying toward Britain. The guns destroyed 68 of them. The German commanders were baffled. They couldn't understand how the Allies had suddenly become sharpshooters. December 1944, the Ardennes Forest. The final chapter of the VT fuse's story took place on the ground during the
Battle of the Bulge. With the secret effectively out, the U.S. Army finally authorized the use of the fuses against ground troops. For centuries, artillery had a limitation. If a shell hit the ground, the mud absorbed most of the explosion. The shrapnel flew up, missing the men hiding in foxholes. To kill men in trenches, you needed a shell that exploded above the ground, an airburst. But timing a fuse to explode at exactly 20 feet high was impossible until now. The American artillery crews set the VT fuses to ground mode. The tiny radars detected the approaching Earth. German soldiers huddled in their open foxholes, waiting for the American barrage to hit the mud. They felt safe. Then the sky above them lit up. The shells exploded exactly 10 meters above their heads, raining shrapnel straight down. There was no cover. There was no escape. General Patton, watching the devastation, wrote in his diary, "The funny fuse won the Battle of the Bulge for us. I think that when all armies get this shell, we'll have to devise some new method of warfare." From the mocking laughter of Japanese pilots in 1942 to the terrified silence of German infantry in 1944, the VT fuse had changed the world. It was a weapon of pure math, a triumph of impossible engineering. It proved that in modern war, the side that controls the technology controls the sky. The Japanese pilots had laughed at the clumsy Americans. They didn't realize that the Americans weren't just shooting bullets. They were shooting light bulbs, radios, and the future itself.